When you see Iran and Strait of Hormuz in the same headline, the assumption that forms immediately is this: the danger is the closure. Every simulation, every war game, every think tank paper runs the same scenario. Iran shuts down the strait. Tankers stop. Oil prices detonate. The global economy seizes within weeks. That is the analysis. That is the briefing. That is what every major government in the world has modeled and prepared for. That analysis is not wrong. But it is also nowhere near the real warning. The real warning, the one that has been sitting in plain sight since 2021, the one that serious strategic planners in Washington, Beijing, and Riyadh have quietly read and deliberately chosen not to discuss in public, is not about the closure. It is about the reopening. Because Iran does not need the strait closed to reshape the world order. Iran needs the world to understand that only Iran can reopen it, and that the price of reopening will be set in Tehran, not in Washington. That is a fundamentally different kind of leverage, not a weapon of disruption, a weapon of negotiation. And it is a weapon that Iran has been building methodically and patiently for 31 years, since the last shot of the Gulf War was fired and Iran watched America walk away, believing it had won. By the end of this analysis, you will understand Iran's Hormuz strategy better than 95% of the people who write about it. And what you understand will be uncomfortable, not because it is alarming, but because it is entirely logical. There are three mechanisms this analysis will walk you through. First, Iran's Mosaic Doctrine, the specific military architecture that has been designed deliberately to make the Strait of Hormuz not just difficult, but strategically unusable without Iranian authorization. Second, the 2021 Iran-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, the 25-year agreement that restructured Iran's leverage position and, critically, gave Iran an economic patron with a direct financial interest in controlling when the strait reopens. Third, the reopening scenario itself, what the terms of a Hormuz reopening would actually look like, who would negotiate them, and what the world looks like on the other side of that negotiation. The anchor number is this: 20.9 million barrels per day, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, January 2024. That is the daily volume of oil and petroleum products that transited the Strait of Hormuz in 2023. More than 20% of all oil traded on Earth. One waterway, one decision, 21 miles. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. For reference, that is roughly the distance between central London and the M25 orbital on a straight line. Two shipping lanes, each 3 miles wide, separated by a median zone. What moves through those lanes every 24 hours is the energy pulse of the modern world. Not just Gulf oil, Asian manufacturing, European chemical industries, South Asian food supply chains. Every one of them runs on fuel that moves through a corridor you could cross in a commercial aircraft in 8 minutes. Iran controls the northern shore of that corridor, and Iran's military strategy for that corridor has a name that matters. It is called the Mosaic Doctrine. It was not designed by Iran's conventional navy. It was designed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, in the years following the Iran-Iraq War, when Iranian military strategists sat with one specific question: how do you make a choke point militarily unusable for a superpower that outguns you in every conventional category? Their answer was not a navy. Their answer was geometry. But here is what no mainstream analysis will say plainly, because it dismantles the entire frame of the threat. The Mosaic Doctrine was not built to close the strait permanently. It was built to give Iran the ability to extract a price for reopening it. And the document that tells you exactly what that price would be was signed in 2021, and China co-signed it. The Mosaic Doctrine layers 5 overlapping military systems, not in a single defensive line, but woven together so that neutralizing one does not degrade the others. Shore-based anti-ship missiles, underwater minefields deployable within hours, fast attack boat swarms capable of overwhelming larger vessels through speed and volume alone. Submarines, 3 Kilo-class vessels, and 21 documented midget submarines, per the International Institute for Strategic Studies Military Balance 2023 report. And, added in the last decade, drone swarms with terminal guidance that have already proven effective in the Red Sea theater. This is not theory. This is documented hardware deployed on a documented coastline. General Kenneth McKenzie, then commander of U.S. Central Command, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in March 2021, and the quote that matters is this: Iran's ballistic missile force is the largest in the Middle East. He was not describing a nuclear threat. He was describing a conventional arsenal of over 3,000 missiles capable of reaching every U.S. base in the Gulf, every oil facility on the Arabian Peninsula, and every tanker transiting the strait, from positions that never move and require no carrier group to project. That is not a threat of closure. That is a threat of calibration. Iran holding a dial and saying, "We decide how unusable this strait becomes. We turn it up, we turn it down. The lever is ours." The historical evidence that this is not hypothetical is the tanker wars of 1984 to 1988. Over those 4 years, Iraq and Iran attacked 543 commercial vessels in the Persian Gulf. Lloyd's of London raised war risk insurance premiums by 300% for ships entering Gulf waters. The United States eventually reflagged Kuwaiti tankers and deployed the Navy under Operation Earnest Will. And here is what the textbooks consistently minimize. Even after the August 1988 ceasefire, war risk insurance premiums in Gulf shipping remained elevated for 3 full years afterward. Not because the guns were still firing, because the market had absorbed a single durable lesson. The Gulf is a space where Iran has demonstrated the willingness and the capability to impose costs. That lesson did not expire. And then in March 2021, something happened that fundamentally changed the strategic calculation, something that the closure-focused analysis has not properly integrated. In March 2021, Iran and China signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, a 25-year agreement that, on its surface, read like an economic arrangement. $400 billion of Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure, energy development, and technology over 2.5 decades. In exchange, Chinese priority access to Iranian oil at a substantial discount. Reuters, in March 2021, reported that discount at approximately $12 per barrel below market price, with tiered reductions tied to purchase volume. Western coverage processed this as Iran finding an economic lifeline under sanctions. That reading is factually accurate. It is also strategically incomplete. What the 25-year deal actually constructed was a structural alignment between Iran's Hormuz leverage and China's core energy security. And those two things cannot be separated anymore. China is the world's largest oil importer. According to the International Energy Agency, as of December 2023, China imported 11.3 million barrels of oil per day. Between 40% and 45% of that volume transits the Strait of Hormuz. The arithmetic is not complicated. China cannot absorb a disrupted strait, and Iran now holds the operational authority over that disruption. This changes the diplomatic geometry in a way that has not been fully priced into Western strategic planning. Before 2021, Iran's Hormuz threat was primarily a threat to the West, to U.S. allies in the Gulf, to European energy markets, to the dollar-denominated global oil system. And the Western response, sanctions, naval presence, diplomatic pressure, was backed by a relatively coherent coalition of interests. The coalition held because every major party with leverage over Iran was, broadly, on the same side. After 2021, that coalition has a structural crack in it. Because an Iran that closes or disrupts the strait is simultaneously threatening the energy supply of its most important economic partner. China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council with veto authority over any multilateral pressure, is no longer neutral in a Hormuz closure scenario. China has a direct financial interest in the disruption ending as fast as possible, and that interest positions China not as a neutral observer of the reopening negotiation. It positions China as Iran's most powerful diplomatic advocate inside that negotiation. This is where your wallet enters the story. 85% of global shipping fuel is derived from crude oil. The IMF's November 2023 World Economic Outlook assessed that a significant Hormuz disruption sustained for 30 days could raise global inflation by 1.8 to 2.4 percentage points. For a household spending $200 per month on basic goods and transportation, food, fuel, utilities, that translates to an additional $22 to $29 every single month indefinitely until supply routes adjust. And supply routes do not adjust in 30 days. The last meaningful Gulf tanker disruption in 2019, limited to 4 vessels, not a full closure, took 11 weeks before insurance markets fully stabilized. Now here is the counterintuitive statistic that changes the frame entirely. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, operates approximately 30 to 35 naval vessels assigned to the Gulf region, as of NavCent's January 2024 public briefing. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. The IRGC Navy has documented capability, in its own published exercises, to deploy over 100 fast attack boats within 20 minutes of activation. The ratio of defending vessels to attacking assets means the strait cannot be held open by conventional naval force against coordinated resistance. Not because American naval power is inadequate in an open ocean context, because the physical geometry of the choke point makes it structurally a defender's weapon. Iran is the defender. The United States is the external power attempting to keep it open. That is the military reality that the freedom of navigation language systematically obscures. And understanding that reality is what makes the next part land correctly. Because what I have described so far, the Mosaic Doctrine, the China alignment, the insurance premium arithmetic, is the setup. The setup for a very specific scenario, the scenario that strategic planners model privately and decline to publish. Here is the part that nobody on television will state plainly. And the reason they will not state it plainly is exactly the reason you need to hear it. Because the closure is not the end game. The closure is the opening bid. What comes after is what reshapes the order. Model the scenario precisely. A US or Israeli military strike hits Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies assessed, in their December 2023 Regional Security Review, the probability of a significant strike on Iranian nuclear facilities at 35 to 40% within 24 months, rising to 55 to 65% in the event of a confirmed Iranian crossing of the 90% uranium enrichment threshold. Within 48 hours of such a strike, Iran activates straight operations. Not a full closure, a deliberate, calibrated disruption. Mines seated in the outer shipping lanes. Fast attack boats harassing tanker transits at the Narrows. Shore-based missile radars activating lock sequences on vessels as they transit. Tanker insurance premiums, currently around $25,000 per voyage per Lloyd's of London's January 2024 published rates, spiked to levels last seen in 1987, effectively prohibitive. The market does not wait for a ship to be sunk. The market prices in the possibility of it. Tankers self-divert, voluntarily, because the actuaries have done the math. Iran does not need to fire a single missile to functionally close the strait. The closure happens because the insurance market closes it. Oil moves to $150 per barrel within 30 days. Goldman Sachs scenario analysis from October 2023 modeled a sustained Gulf disruption, producing $185 per barrel within 90 days. The United States responds with naval escalation. The same geometry applies. Every carrier group that moves into the Gulf reduces its operational flexibility and puts 5,000 sailors within Hormuz engagement range of IRGC assets that have spent 30 years preparing for exactly that configuration. The US has the superior hardware. Iran has the superior geography. Neither side wins a short, decisive engagement. And then, here is the scenario step that almost every published model skips over. Iran waits. Iran does not seek a decisive military victory. Iran seeks a negotiating position. Because this is not a war of conquest. This is a war of leverage. And the leverage is entirely in who controls the terms of the reopening. 3 weeks into the disruption, with oil at $160, with Chinese manufacturing facing acute input cost crises, with Indian refineries running at reduced capacity because alternate supply routes cannot absorb the volume, Beijing sends a diplomatic envoy, not to Washington, to Tehran, because Beijing's interest is not in who wins the military confrontation. Beijing's interest is in oil flowing again, under any political terms that end the disruption. And China's seat at the table is no longer that of a neutral mediator. China is Iran's economic guarantor. China has leverage over both sides. And China's preferred outcome, a settlement that reduces U.S. military presence in the Gulf, happens to align precisely with Iran's stated terms for reopening. Tehran's conditions: formal suspension of all secondary sanctions, international recognition of Iran's right to civilian nuclear enrichment at agreed thresholds, a phased, documented withdrawal of U.S. carrier groups from Gulf waters, not permanent, not maximalist, precisely calibrated, designed to be exactly acceptable enough to end the disruption and exactly consequential enough to shift the regional balance of power in a way that does not reverse. Before we continue, this deserves a full stop. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as of early 2024, over 2.6 million Iranian civilians live within 50 kilometers of the military infrastructure this analysis treats as a strategic variable. Across the Gulf states, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, Oman, an estimated 35 million people live within the disruption radius of a serious Hormuz conflict. The Abqaiq processing complex and the Ras Tanura export terminal on Saudi Arabia's eastern coast, together handling more than 7% of global oil supply, sit within that radius as well. Behind every strategic calculation made in Washington, Beijing, or Tehran are communities, livelihoods, and families with no voice in any of the decisions being described here. Those 35 million people are not a statistic. They are the actual stakes of every abstraction in this analysis. Now, the gap between what is officially stated and what is observably happening. The U.S. State Department stated in February 2024 that freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz is non-negotiable. At the same time, 2 U.S. destroyers were quietly repositioned from Bahrain to international waters following Houthi escalations in January 2024, as reported by Defense News in January 2024. At the same time, the Pentagon has awarded $2.3 billion in contracts since October 2023 for anti-drone systems specifically engineered for Gulf theater deployment. The stated position says non-negotiable. The observable preparation says we are actively modeling a scenario in which the negotiation happens regardless of whether we want it to. That gap between the announced position and the physical preparations is not a contradiction. It is the most honest signal available. And it tells you that at the highest levels of the U.S. defense establishment, the reopening scenario is not a theoretical exercise. It is a planning document. Step back from the military geometry for a moment, because here is what everything I have just walked you through, the Mosaic Doctrine, the China alignment, the reopening price, actually tells you about the next 20 years. And what it tells you is not what the headlines are selling. What I want you to take from this is not alarm. Alarm is not useful. What is useful is the map. And before I give you that map, the counter-argument deserves a genuinely fair hearing, because serious analysts at the RAND Corporation and the Brookings Institution look at everything described here and arrive somewhere considerably calmer. Their argument is this: Iran's economy depends on oil export revenues. The Strait of Hormuz is the only viable route for Iranian oil exports. Closing it is structurally self-defeating. Iran has issued Hormuz closure threats more than a dozen times since 1979 and has never executed a full closure. The threat is a negotiating instrument, not an actionable military strategy. Those analysts have serious credentials. Every one of those factual points is accurate. The flaw in the reasoning is precise. It assumes Iran is attempting to close the strait indefinitely. Iran is not. The leverage has never been in permanent closure. Permanent closure destroys Iran's own export revenue. The actual leverage, the real strategic asset, is in a temporary, calibrated, conditions-based disruption of sufficient duration to produce a negotiated outcome, long enough to make the cost of no deal unbearable, short enough to be credibly presented as a manageable off-ramp. That is a structurally different instrument from the permanent closure that the counter-argument addresses. And it is an instrument for which Iran has the military architecture, the economic patron, and 30 years of demonstrated strategic patience. The honest picture, stripped of both the panic and the complacency, is this: the probability of a full, sustained Hormuz closure remains low. The probability of a significant, politically managed disruption, sustained long enough to force a negotiated settlement, is rising. And the terms of that settlement, not the disruption itself, will determine the structure of Middle Eastern geopolitics for the next generation. Here is what to watch. 3 specific observable indicators. Watch the Iran-China oil discount. As of March 2024, Reuters reported that discount at $9 to $12 per barrel below market price. If that number falls below $6, meaning China is willing to pay closer to market price for guaranteed Iranian supply, it signals that China is purchasing insurance against anticipated disruption. That is not commerce. That is positioning. Watch the IRGC naval exercise frequency. According to Iranian state news agency IRNA, the IRGC conducted 12 major naval exercises in 2023 compared to 6 in 2021. Any significant increase in that cadence, particularly exercises focused on mining operations or coordinated fast attack boat deployment, is a signal of preparation, not demonstration. Watch the U.S. carrier group rotation schedule in the 5th Fleet. When a carrier group departs Gulf waters and its scheduled replacement is delayed by more than 2 weeks, which NavCent historically publishes in advance, that coverage gap is the operational window that Iran's strategic planners would rationally time any escalation to coincide with. Those 3 data points tracked together will tell you more about where this situation is heading than any headline will tell you 3 days after it's already in motion. The 1973 Arab oil embargo did not destroy the world by closing supply. It restructured the world by reopening supply, on OPEC's terms. The petrodollar system that emerged from the post-embargo settlement was not designed in the years before the closure. It was negotiated in the months after the reopening. The power transferred in the reopening was larger than anything the closure itself could have produced. That pattern has been sitting in the history books for 50 years. What we are watching now is whether it is being studied more carefully in Tehran or in Washington. Wars almost never begin because everyone decided they wanted one. They become inevitable because nobody mapped the leverage until it was already decisive. The Strait of Hormuz will not reshape the world by closing. It will reshape the world by reopening on someone else's terms.